Sir Salman Rushdie, thank you for such a well thought out, and as can be well expected, extremely well worded. Every word was a gem out there. I wish I could have noted everything down. It was a complete understanding of what an artist goes through and what art means to society. I think you put it so well in terms of the direction in which society is heading, and in particular India, and of course M.F. Hussein's plight, which I think a lot of us sympathize with. Let me, before I open it up for questions to the floor, let me just take you up on the theme which you're talking about in terms of the country which you admired so much, India, in terms of its tolerance. And you've described many examples of the way India is going in terms of being intolerant towards a lot of artists, whether in painting or in books. Why do you think this is happening? What is it, you know India well, what is it that is making India go down this path? And if I may add on top of that, is it this hijacking by the lunatic, fanatic fringe in society because they speak louder and go out on the streets and so forth? And a similar thing happening to radical Islam, meaning radical Islam again hijacking Islam in many ways and pulling it in a direction which is again leading to violence and so forth. What is this well springs of this?
Well, I'll push something. Is this working? Yeah, all right. Well, the growth of narrowly religious ideology in this country has been a phenomenon of the last couple of decades. On both sides, and it seems as if one side tries to outdo the other. The rise of Hinduism, and the rise of the parallel rise of Islamic extremism is a sad fact, and it's not helped by what you mentioned earlier, which is a kind of vote bag politics. People playing to that gallery and privileging it. How to change it? I don't know the answer to that. It needs politicians to develop a backbone, which that doesn't seem to be likely to happen anytime soon. And for the public and all arms of the public, such as the media, to stand up and say that enough's enough, that this is not the country in which we want to live. It's not what this country has been historically, and it's not what it should be. But do you see a fundamental contradiction here, that here is a democratic country which in fact encourages freedom, and this very freedom is in fact used for intolerance? Yeah. Well, how do you marry the two? Well, one of the great questions, I think, is what are the limits of freedom, and does one tolerate the intolerant? One of the great mistakes, of course, historically made in Europe was the toleration of the Nazi Party as it rose. The sense that it should be allowed to exist in a free society, and then, of course, when that party took power, it destroyed the system that brought it to power. So I think there is a limit to structural tolerance in a society, which is that you have to exclude from that tolerance those people who would destroy the society that tolerates it. There's a similar example in Algeria, when the radical Islamist party of the FIS, the FIS, was allowed to stand in elections even though it did not agree to the secular principles which were supposed to be necessary to stand in elections. And then when it came to power, it immediately set about destroying the electoral system that had elected it. So these are big questions, the limits of tolerance, and I think we need to debate them in this country, because the levels of intolerance that now are allowed to exist under the umbrella of tolerance are in danger of destroying the tolerance that makes it possible for them to speak their mind. So, this is a profound philosophical question, and we're not going to answer it here, but we need to know that that question is at the heart of the trouble.
In India, just to continue this a little bit, one would have expected that with on one side the rise of Hindu fundamentalism, but also the fact that the right-wing parties actually came into power and actually ran governments. Normally what happens, like it happens for communists and leftists, that when they come into power, in fact, they move to the center and they become more tolerant, and they don't, they blunt their extremism a bit. So that, on one side, that has happened in India, and that's a recent phenomenon. So why do you think that this has not blunted the edge of the fanatics?
Well, I suppose for the reason I said that it's interesting that the argument has moved towards culture. You know, it's very strange that such things as cultural artifacts should become what are most argued over. And it's because they're easy to target. These are weak targets. They're not, as I said, they don't have armies and defenders. And what happens, unfortunately, is that very often here, the people who are being targeted are blamed for being for being responsible for their own misfortune. So instead of, protecting people against a rioting mob, they get arrested. Their work gets seized. And this is a kind of upside down, an inversion of correct behavior, which gives, of course, great energy to those people who would destroy these cultural artifacts, and it makes it likely it'll happen more often, and so it happens more often. And again, this is not. It is happening a lot in India, and that's true, but it's not only in India. And there was a terrible case in England a couple of years ago when a young woman playwright, Sikh playwright, wrote a play about the Sikh community in England, which included a description of a sexual assault taking place inside a gurdwara in England. And the play was threatened, and the police and the government actually refused to protect the production, and it had to stop. And so here was a case of complete surrender to a very small group. It doesn't take many people. That's one of the tragedies of our age. It doesn't take very many people to create this kind of disruption. And in theory, that should mean it's very easy to stand up against them. Because if there's not that many of them, you should be able to deal with them. But every time you surrender to them, you multiply them. Next time there's 10 times as many. Then you surrender to those, the next time there's 10 times as many as that. So the surrender creates the increase of the problem.
Would you say that the British government acted well when the fatwa was issued against you, gave you protection, stood it up against? A good example for a state standing up for one of its citizens.
The British government took the unoriginal position that if foreign powers tried to execute one of their citizens, they should try and make sure it doesn't happen. And the fact that they did that to one of their citizens who wasn't even a supporter of a party then in power is a further example of the principled nature of that position. So yes, of course. I mean, it was. I'm very grateful for it. That was the way it happened, and it would be nice if other governments were to take the lead from that and to make sure that people being attacked by whatever level of threat, should be defended against it rather than blamed for it.
Okay, I'll open it up to the floor. Please raise your hand and identify yourself. Madhu?
Is there a microphone? Oh.
Thank you. So Rushdie, I fully endorse, and I'm sure I'm voicing the views of majority, if not all, my fellow delegates. Very logical, very convincing. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
So I'm curious about the fact that when you wrote Satanic Verses, did you envisage the kind of reaction or the overreaction? And if given an opportunity, would you go for Satanic Verses 2, if I may put it that way, given the kind of reaction that you saw, or would you defend the free artistic expression? And I wish M.F. Hussain was next to you. I would have asked him the same question. Thank you.
Well, I mean, it would have been very difficult to forecast what happened, if only because such a thing had never happened to any writer before. You know, if I had told you on the book's publication day that there was going to be a campaign of international terrorism aimed against me, you would probably have thought that I was megalomaniac. You know, how could books be as important as that? It's even stranger because my previous novel, Shame, was given a prize in Iran. First they pirated it, and then they gave it a prize for the best novel published in translation in Iran that year. I never saw the prize, I never saw any money, but I was told that it did win this prize, and so when the Satanic Verses was published, even in Iran, people thought, oh well, the book by Rushdie must be okay because the mullahs like it because they gave him that prize. And so the English language bookstores in Tehran and elsewhere imported very large numbers of copies of the Satanic Verses and sold them without any trouble for 6 months. From September 1988 to February 1989, the book was on sale in Tehran and elsewhere in Iran without a single objection being raised to it. Then came the fatwa in February 1989, and of course the book was suddenly no longer on sale. But that's an example of how unexpected what happened was. I don't know. I don't watch the Satanic Verses is a novel. At the end of the novel, the story's over. I mean, I can't imagine what I would do in Satanic Verses 2. I'm afraid I'll just have to write my next book and see who that upsets. But I think, of course, one of the things about the kind of variant telling of the story of the birth of a religion not unlike Islam in that book is that, of course, it was clear that very orthodox, conservative-minded people might not like what I'd done. But, as I said in my speech, it was absolutely not incumbent on them to read it, Of course, as we also heard, they didn't need to read it in order to take their position. That used to upset me a lot, the fact that people would attack the book without reading it. And then I realized that if you look at the history of literature and the attacks on various novels, the people who attacked them have never read them. The people who accused James Joyce's Ulysses of being pornographic had obviously never read James Joyce's Ulysses, because great as Joyce's genius is, the arousing of sexual desire is really not one of his gifts. The people who accused Nabokov's extraordinarily moral Lolita of being a work of immoral pedophilia had clearly never read that. And so it came to me as a consolation to realize that not reading the book that you're going to burn is maybe a precondition for burning it. If you do something as complicated as actually reading it, maybe the match doesn't light so easily. So of course these things must be allowed. It seems to me that even inside the Islamic tradition, there is plenty that says that this is acceptable behavior. The Prophet Muhammad himself always objected to being deified. The reason for calling himself the messenger and for objecting to the Christians' deification of their prophet was precisely because he said he was only a man. And not a divine entity. One of the reasons for the Muslim prohibition on representations, visual representations of the Prophet, was that he feared that if there were paintings of him, that people would worship the paintings. There's the famous story after the death of the Prophet when people were mourning, and his friend Abu Bakr came to the crowd and said, if there are those who worship Muhammad, then you must mourn because Muhammad is dead. But if there are those who worship God, then you should rejoice for God is alive. That these are very old traditions in Islam, that the Prophet of Islam is not to be deified. He is to be treated as a man who brought a message. And the novel does no more than that. It does no more than that. It does no more than what the Prophet himself would have approved of, in my view. It is other people, subsequently, who tried to elevate the Prophet of Islam into some kind of divine, semi-divine figure. And it seems to me that, if you like, is the offense against Islam.
Anybody else? Oh, Bobby.
So Salman, Bobby Seigel.
Hi.
I don't wish to ask you a question for the sake of asking you a question. I'd just like to make a comment. And that is that all of us here in this house, when we receive a masterful speech of art and prose like we have from you, I hope we can walk away from this house, each one, and on behalf of everyone, with a copy of your speech. I think that in itself is a mastery of literature that we have seen. And secondly, I hope the purpose that we come to the India Today conclave is for all of us to be able to provoke the mind and the thought, and I think you've done a lot in that respect. I hope this speech is not only given to all of us in this August audience, but it gets published by India Today, but also by other magazines and other newspapers in India, for other Indians to read what you've said about our great country. Thank you.
Well, we'll see what we can do.
We'll get you a copy, Bobby, don't worry. Yes.
So Salman, I'd just like you to reflect a little bit more on the relationship between political freedom and artistic freedom. After all, the Bombay that you celebrated was a post-imperial Bombay.
Yeah.
There was a great efflorescence of writing under the Tsar in Russia in the 19th century. You'd mentioned China, but in fact my sense is that artistic achievement in China at the moment is much, much more committed than artistic achievement in India. So how do you see the relationship between the two?
Well, I certainly don't believe that persecution is good for art. There has been remarkable art produced in repressive societies. And that's to say, if we only think about the famous samizdat literature of the Soviet Union, that was clearly an extraordinary joint effort by many writers and intellectuals to overcome the restraints of that society. Today, we can see that one of the most celebrated cinemas in the world is the cinema of Iran. And clearly, filmmakers there have found ways to create great art even inside the very restricted confines of the Iran of the Ayatollahs. On the whole, it can also be the case that freedom is bad for art sometimes, because, just to contradict myself, because since the fall of the Soviet Union, it seems as if Russian literature has gone into terminal decline. And not just Russian literature, but the literature of Eastern Europe has been much damaged by no longer having an enemy. And now everybody wants to read John Grisham novels, and God help us, Dan Brown novels. I think Dan Brown is the single most depressing fact about modern literature.